Hi, Dr. Kelly Watson here, and today I'm going to talk about how to productively share the findings of your research with clients. Um, presuming you have done a really good job of needs assessment in the beginning and that you've done your data collection, you've come up with some insights that you want to share, how do we productively do that in a way that isn't just information overload and again is something actionable that they can work with? Uh, all right, I'm going to share my screen and share a little bit under the hood of some of the stuff that we do. Um, so one of the things that we do is we provide back a report, and there are sections to this report. The first part of it, we know that reading detailed reports is not something that a lot of people are going to do. We do often get somebody in an organization that wants to know all the details, and so they will read the entire thing. But for the most part, executives don't have a ton of time, so they want everything to be boiled down in a really salient way. But you also want to have, the deep dive data in case they have a question about a particular area of focus. So I'm going to give you an example of just our engagement report. Obviously we have lots of different areas of study that we do for clients, but this is an area that I just had handy and thought that it would be good to kind of show you because it's sort of similar to how we would do it for a lot of other reports. So the first thing we do is we actually restate what our understanding of their objective of the study is, and that's important because if that's not what they were hoping to get and we've are misaligned, boy, we want to figure that out quickly. By the way, we always do a draft report presentation before we actually provide this report to the seniors. So if, for example, in our case, HR or some team within HR generally is the one who engages us and is our main contact for the study. We will give them a draft walkthrough before we walk the executives through. And it's great because sometimes we've uncovered something that translated in their environment it makes sense to them in a way that didn't to us. And so we think it's a big finding and they're like, well, actually the reason for that is X. So it's just always a really good thing to do is to walk them through a draft before you do the big, presentation. Allows them to give input on maybe how you've understood something differently and, gives you a chance to calibrate. Also gives you a chance to go rerun or go deeper on a particular aspect of data that they find interesting that maybe you thought was no big deal. So anyway, in that, when we focus on, reiterating for them what we understand the objective to be, this can also create, can resolve any areas of confusion that may have happened in the throughout the process. So reiterating it back to them makes sure that that's what it is that is their objective. Okay. So important, and again, important that it be brief and concise so that they can understand what your understanding is and weigh in if that's not the case. We then have a really great, sort of section overview, and we make this clickable so that folks can go to any part of the report. And then we also give them a how to read this report so that if somebody is reading through it and they want to find something, this is just a really good way to orient them to what you're providing. And I say this because, this is a 105-page report, and it's important to help them navigate through it in a quick and easy way. So then in the next section, we describe the process we went through to get to the data and then kind of what the demographics are of the study. So in this case, our process was simply a survey. So we didn't do what we normally would, which is have a page in here that describes all the different mechanisms that we were using to collect data. So if we were doing survey plus focus groups plus interviews with certain people, we would give a detailed explanation of how people were selected, what are some examples of questions that were asked, how it was done, was it semi-structured, was it wide open, who facilitated, all of those types of things so that they understood the process by which the study was done. In this case, it was merely a survey, and they knew that, and we've done this survey for them many times, so we didn't feel we needed to explain. Then we usually do a demographic, like who participated in the survey. These are just descriptive statistics. And we will say how many respondents in total took the survey and whether or not we felt that that was statistically significant. Obviously, 725 is a pretty good number. And in this, we will often put what percentage of the organization this was. I took that information off so that this organization can be identified, but you know, you can do the math easily and show what percent of their population actually responded, and then what all the different breakdowns by division and things like that. When we're working with clients, we use their language for the most part with how to define race or ethnicity, or we default to the EEOC. And in this case, the EEOC was what was defaulted to. For sex, the same thing. They call it sex in their organization. So it was not gender, even though gender is what was defined here with this non-binary, you know. We will go to a deeper level if an organization wants to. So we do have some clients that want to know much more detailed. They want to know sexual orientation, things like that. One of the things, though, is when you are doing surveys, a couple things. First, we always provide a prefer not to answer option because people worry that even though we're an outside agency conducting the survey, which tends to protect privacy better than, you know, if the organization was doing it, or at least build trust. Sometimes people feel like if they get too granular that we could figure out who they are and that there'd be some negative repercussion. So we're careful to advise clients not to go to that detail or to offer them a prefer not to answer. The second thing we do is we ask demographic questions at the end of the survey. So we've already captured everything else. And if they decide to abandon the survey at that point, we still have their results. We can't report demographics of their results, but we at least have their results in the rest of it. So just something to think about with demographics, but it is really valuable to be able to, especially job role, especially if you have an organization where sex or gender can be a factor. And we have often seen significant differences in opinion between gender or between race. And generation's another one, you know, significant generational disconnects. And really, really important because obviously, because, you know, first of all, if your younger generation are the most unhappy, you're going to have a turnover problem in the future that you want to deal with. It's also important because if your entire executive team, or if the client's entire executive team are male or white or female, and there is a disconnect between how the genders feel, how different folks of a different gender feel about the organization, having the executive team speak on their behalf can be problematic. And we've often seen this where we have a homogenous senior leadership team that thinks they know how people feel and thinks they're making decisions that benefit the whole organization, but really it's self-fulfilling and benefits folks just like them. You know, and as you can imagine, that can be pretty problematic. So really great to be able to report survey results with all of these. Now, I will say that you notice that in this particular population, American Indian, Alaska Native is a very small group, as is even multiracial is a pretty small group. We will, at that point, probably collapse any further results that we would report so that the one person or the 2 or 3 people in the organization don't get identified by their responses. So it's important to make sure that you're not reporting back anything identifiable. Same with if there was a particular, like if we had reported on traditionalists here and there was one of them, well, we're obviously not going to report anywhere else in the survey how traditionalists feel about things because they're going to figure out who it is pretty quickly. So be careful of that. Then again, because this is a long report and, you know, you've got senior leaders that are going to want the information processed, we do an executive summary. So what are the key most salient points? What are the most, in this case, key takeaways, drivers of engagement, and areas of opportunity. We also have a couple of outcome variables. You know, we obviously had engagement, but we also measured Net Promoter Score. We measured percent of respondents that enjoyed working at the org, because that was a question they requested we add. It was not a scale. So it didn't show up in any of our other work because we're very scale and literature driven, but they wanted it reported, so we reported it. And we also measured the outcome variable of turnover intention. So we reported that here. We then report the total engagement number. We also reported demographics on that. We then did the subtypes and what that meant. And of course, the engagement drivers. These are the regressions that we ran to see what were the things that drove their outcome variable the most. These are all the independent variables that drive those outcome variables and how they ranked. So I've talked about this in more detail in another video, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is the money slide for this presentation. You know, if this is the one that the executives care about the most. And it took us a lot of iterations to get to a way of showing this information in a way that they could absorb. And a client actually helped us with how to present this data in a way that was meaningful for them. And we were fortunate enough to be able to use that for future clients. So basically this section at the top just really talks about, you know, the overall key topics and the key deliverable, you know, what is the end result of what we were trying to do. So then the next section, we actually break it down into the things that, you know, we saw as the key challenges. So we will have a page on, you know, the first challenge, sometimes we call it opportunity, you know, spinning the language in a way that a client can hear is really, really important. You know, in this particular one, we changed the word challenge to opportunity because they had such high scores. And so it was really tough for us to go in and say, well, you have this big challenge, because the seniors are going to go, well, I don't care. My engagement score is really, really high. So what we really focused on with this client was, okay, yes, they're high, but they're lower than they were previously. And, you know, you have some opportunities that would help you make sure that the score doesn't decline further in the future. And so we focused them on that. So we then provide some qualitative, I'm not going to click on any of the comments slides, but we provide them with some stuff from the qualitative analysis that we did as well to support it. And then we give them a recommendation. So we'll have a slide on what the recommendation is and the types of things that, you know, again, empirically, we know, you know, drive that particular challenge. So we do as much as possible stick to what has been proven in the literature, not just, you know, our opinions of things. And then we would provide the second opportunity and the second recommendation, third, depending on how many we have. Now, 3 is a good number because people can focus on that and they can, you know, see tangible results. They can measure to them. It's something that companies can absorb. And especially if you're doing this often, like every year, every 2 years, they're not going to get more than 3 things done in the time between surveys. And you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're saying the same thing over and over again, because it's not valuable for them. And if you find that you have told them to do this before and they haven't done it, then you need to figure out a way for them to digest it more easily. Like maybe the actions you recommended they take don't work in their culture, or, you know, are problematic in some way. But, you know, you don't want to put them in a position where the employees are frustrated and say, I told them this before and they didn't do it. So you're going to have to find a way to frame it in a different way and provide recommendations that are just more achievable for them to get done, because maybe your recommendations were too esoteric and high level and they weren't able to execute. So we really try to be very concrete in why we've said this is a challenge. So we will bring out some highlights from the data. X% of people said this, you know, we will put that on the slide. And then when we give them the recommendation, we will be very concrete about this, you know, form a committee to tackle this. Here are the actions you need to take. Here's, you know, so that it's not, it's something achievable. If you think about the SMART goal framework, for example, that the goals need to be specific, they need to be measurable, they need to be achievable, all of those things. So don't tell people to, get better at communication. Be specific. What area of communication is their struggle from the data? And then what are some concrete ways and best practices that organizations have used to improve that? And if you don't know, again, go back to the literature. The literature can tell you how to achieve some of these impactful variables, and find something where a study shows that organizations that did X ended up with an impact to Y. This is where you as a DBA really have an advantage over most practitioners, because you have access to the data, or an understanding of how to read the data and read the academic papers and then translate them into practice for folks. So this is what we do in that section. And oftentimes, this is as far as we get with executives, because this is about an hour of presentation time, which is mostly what you're going to get with a senior exec. If you're walking through it on the draft, this is where we stop and say, what's your feedback? Does this resonate? Are you hearing this in the organization? And this is where we get the nod from the team that, yeah, this sounds right. This sounds like what we've seen. And we very rarely have not had that nod, or nothing's a surprise. You're doing a lot of work that's showing an organization what they kind of already know, but didn't know how to put into words or do it in such a concrete way, and certainly didn't have it evidence-based. So this is usually the point where we stop and check in, are we good? Now, the rest of the report we actually have are the specific results. So in each section, we'll go through what is the engagement results, and we do it by all the different demographics. And these are just descriptive statistics. So we're just showing them, and we combine it with the qual data that we've received too. So we'll go through and show them all their drivers, and we organize them in the order that the drivers came out on the regression analysis. And then at the very end, we will also include the regression outputs, so that if they do have a statistician on board, the statistician can check our work and say, yes, you've done a good job at this, or no, you haven't. So we walk people through that. Again, when we get the nod from their own organization, actually what we normally get is oh my gosh, yes. And then they will dive into they'll say, well, how did that break out by demographic group? So one of our findings may be that it's different by demographic group, and that's always enlightening. And so that helps us narrow down. And then the client may say, well, can you run it this way? Can you run the data this way? And so this is our opportunity to go back and be able to run another statistic if it's the case that, we haven't included all of the cuts in our appendix. Now, that said, we usually have a good sense, because we also will look at it and say, well, that's interesting. And so we'll go dive down into a particular area. Like, for example, on the company support scale, there is something about safety in the workplace. And, we've had a client that has significant workplace safety problems because of the nature of their business. And that, stood out as, even though the scale overall had a pretty good score, that variable stood out as, or that question stood out as, pretty strongly different result from the rest of the scale. And the qualitative comments backed it up. So ding, 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 safety is a concern. So we will then go run safety by location, safety by different things, and really hone in on the safety variable, so that, they have a picture of what's happening with safety. And then we will, in that particular case, since we're not actual experts in workplace safety, we will then call in an expert, or go to the back to the literature and say, what does the literature say about safety? How can we help in this case? So then we pull information that can be helpful. And we also have that conversation with the client, like, what have you done about safety? And then how can we, help you improve that? So that's how we usually frame that conversation. Again, the visuals, the slides, the deck is really just the visual tool. and the supportive data to get them to the point where, you want to get them to the point where everybody's agreeing on the challenge and why the challenge is important. And that's where the regressions come in. And then and then you've opened the dialogue for what the solution could be. And I will caution you, oftentimes consultants only see problems that they have the solution to and want to funnel them immediately into a solution they deliver. And I think as a junior consultant back in the day, we probably were more like that. We were primarily a training company, so everybody needed training. But as we've matured and as we've gotten more experience over time and confidence that our work is good, we have been more confident at really showcasing the challenges from a bigger picture, even if it's not something we can help them solve. And then we can always tap partners or find other people to bring in solutions or help them with that process. So it's been in our longer term interest to really disassociate ourselves from, oh, that's something we do, and therefore can be the solution provider, to let's figure out what they really need. And if we're the provider, great, but I'm confident that they're going to call us back in the future for something else anyway. So not to be so focused on steering them to a solution that we have. And I think that just comes with experience and maturity in the long run. And so you may want to demonstrate that as well with your clients, to make sure that you're not pushing them towards things that, conveniently are the things that you offer, and it'll also help you branch into new work, because maybe it's something that you don't do, but it's an adjacency. I mean, we got into engagement surveys because we were doing other work and people said, well, wait, can you do engagement? And we thought, sure, let's do that. Let's partner. And our first client was our test case, and we priced it accordingly. And they were super at helping us through that process and providing us with, an opportunity to try something that it turns out we're actually pretty good at. So, so trust yourself, I think, in that respect, and be willing to go outside the box for offering up challenges and solutions that don't necessarily fall under your, purview. So overall, we walk people through that. We give them an opportunity to weigh back in and ask us for different cuts. And then we present it. Usually the next step is to present it to their senior team. And then we get their feedback. And sometimes the senior team will also say, well, can you look into this? Because they have a different perspective too. And so then we will do another cut. And then we really highly recommend to them that they have a version that goes to the whole organization, because it's really unfair to ask people to spend their time providing information in the form of focus groups or surveys or interviews or what have you, and then not give them back the results. In fact, it's almost guaranteed that they will not do it again. And you have nothing to hide. You should have nothing to hide. And so I think from, when you're working with a client, you should set the expectation up front that this is something that if they're going to do it, they need to share it. And you can help, create a version that meets the need of communicating with the organization, but doesn't necessarily unearth any dirty laundry that you wouldn't want to go out to the public. So even though it's confidential, there's that disgruntled employee that goes and posts something on the internet, and can basically out an organization for, things that an organization shouldn't be outed for. Like, obviously if they're willing to work on challenges, then we have to give them the grace to let the organization do that. So that part can be a really tricky balance between, what are we going to share, and what, and not sharing anything, which will just inflame resentment and make any situation, any challenge far worse. So we will then often create a version for the public kind of thing for a client so that they can share it in a town hall or It may even be a one pager or an email that says, hey, we heard this, we are absolutely putting a committee together to work on this, or whatever it might be. We have had one organization, probably the organization that had the hardest data to absorb in terms of negative or challenging information. And we thought, that's it, we're fired. They're going to shut us out, and this will be the end of this. And they won't. And to their credit, they had a town hall that was 2,000 employees were on the call, and they had us share the results, and they didn't want us to pull any punches. They shared the whole thing. And then more employees weighed in, on the call, and, added to the piled on in many ways. And the management team sat there, and with the exception of one person, did not take it defensively and said, yep, we hear you, we're going to work on it. And that management team had so many coins in the meter when it came to the employees, and being able to get some of the changes done. One of the things they did was change over a lot of the management team, because they heard loud and clear that the management team was the problem. Little consultant secrets, always the management team, but they, to their credit, heard that and turned over the management team significantly, and tackled the stuff, like formed committees, brought people in, did a ton of work because they heard people, and people responded really, really well. So that's just a little anecdote to share if you're having trouble, getting clients to receive the information and share the information, that, it's not always going to be out on the internet as a bad thing for the company. Oftentimes it's, this is the best thing the company ever did. So I hope that was helpful, and good luck in sharing information with clients.